Hey everyone, welcome back to The First City, an Ironsworn actual play. This is session 3, so check out the first 2 sessions if you want to catch up. A quick recap. In the previous session, our hero Lucia and her new acquaintance Pendry survived an attack by a gigantic bear, only to plummet down a steep ravine. Whoa. With Pendry gravely injured, Lucia vowed to bring him home to the town of Timberwall. So basically, in the previous sessions, our player character Lucia met this stranger who turned out to be a man named Pendry, and he comes from the town of Timberwall. Pendry was attacked by a bear and fell down a ravine, which is terrible luck. So he is not doing well. He's on the brink of death, unfortunately. I guess that would be pretty unfortunate. So yes, Lucia has vowed to bring him home. That's the inciting incident vow or starting vow. I forget what it's called in the Ironsworn rulebook. That's our first important vow other than our background vow. So yeah, we're going to see how that goes. We'll see if Lucia can follow through on her mission to bring Pendry home to Timberwall. So our characters, we have 2 of them so far. There's Lucia, our player character. She's 19 years old, descended from those who invaded the old world, outcast from Ironlander society. So basically in our world, we got to the Ironlands because we were driven out of our previous land, the old world, by invaders. Lucia's family is descended from those invaders, so she is ostracized by Ironlander society. And the feeling is mutual. She doesn't like them either, so she's very much a loner. That's her character type. Pendry, he's 21 years old, a wealthy young townsman who was lost in Bleakwood Forest. Lucia found him and offered to bring him home. And unfortunately, they were soon thereafter attacked by a giant bear, an elder beast, and Pendry was wounded, and then he fell down a ravine, as did Lucia. So that's where we're at. Our heroes are both injured, Pendry much more so, and we're at the bottom of a ravine, so we're going to have to get out of there. So let's see how that goes. As for our player character stats, Lucia has a high edge score, so that's 3, decent iron, decent wits, and then low heart, low shadow. Her weapon of choice is the bow and arrow, and that's why she has a high edge score. That's the stat that deals with long-ranged combat. Her health is at 3 out of 5. She got hurt when she fell down the ravine. Her spirit is at 1 out of 5 because she was shook up by encountering the elder bear. She's at full supply, which is nice. We'll see how long that lasts. And her momentum is at 3. She has a few assets, which you can see here. The hound companion is not with her at the moment, so that's why there's not going to be a dog for at least half of this session. We'll see if he comes back later. Her background vow is to found the first city of the Ironlands, which is a very long-term vow, so we're not going to deal with that too much today. Her more pertinent vow is her vow to bring Pendry home to Timberwall. That is what we're going to be focusing on mostly for this session. And speaking of which, this session is going to be a little bit more complex than our previous sessions. In this session, we're going to have 2 major examples of game mechanics. We're going to have a journey and a vow. So the vow, as I just explained, is bringing Pendry home to Timberwall. But the vow is closely tied with a journey because we have to journey from the forest where we're at to Timberwall. So this whole session will basically be that journey and how it ties in with the vow. So we're going to have 2 progress tracks at once. All right, so we're just about ready to begin. Actually, we are ready to begin. We're beginning now. All right, so gameplay. Each of these sessions, I like to start out with an epigraph, which is like a quote or some sort of in-world lore that kind of grounds us in the universe of the story. So I have one here. And for this epigraph, it's a quote from a character, and the character needed a name. And so I rolled on the Ironlander names oracle table, and I got a 73, and that gave me the options Perilous and Sendra. So this character is Lucia's dad, and out of those 2 options, I kind of like the name Sendra for a male character. So yeah, Lucia's dad is now named Sendra. And as I explained in the session 0 of this campaign, I have this concept called a name pool, where basically if I roll for names on the oracle tables, if I don't use a name, I'll put it into the name pool. That way we can use them later. So we don't, reduce, reuse, recycle. We don't waste any of the names that we rolled up. So currently our name pool has 2 names in it, Shekhar and Perilous. So we'll see if we can use those later on in our campaign. All right, so here we go. Our epigraph is, I've never been able to decide which part of the Havens is most likely to kill a man. The animals, the people, or the terrain itself? And that quote is from Sendra of the Havens, father of Lucia, so Lucia's dad. And in case it wasn't clear earlier, Lucia's parents are deceased, sadly. Classic JRPG or classic anime origin story, our hero is an orphan. I also start each session with an action and theme oracle phrase. I roll on the action and the theme tables, and I combine the results into a phrase, and I'm going to try to incorporate that phrase in the story somehow. It doesn't have to be a huge part of it, but if I get stuck for ideas, I'm going to try to use this oracle phrase to influence the story. That's my way of using oracles in this campaign. For this one, our action was uncover, and our theme was knowledge. So our phrase is uncover knowledge. That seems like a pretty softball kind of oracle phrase. Basically, as long as we discover something, discover some information, that should cover it. And actually, this fits in really well towards the end of this session, because at the end of this session, we discover some surprising information. Hopefully it's surprising. It might be a little bit cliche, so you might see it coming from a mile away. But for the character, for Lucia, it's surprising. So we'll find out what that is at the end of the session. All right, here we go. Although her task was clear, to bring Pendry home to Timberwall before the ill-fated young man succumbed to his grievous injuries, Lucia found herself faced with more questions than answers. For one thing, she was lost. The pair's escape from the elder beast, not to mention their fall down the steep ravine, had brought them to a part of the forest Lucia had never been to before. She had to find a way out of the ravine. Then she could focus on getting out of Bleakwood Forest. But first, she needed to do something about her hands. When she had fallen from the ravine wall, her frantic attempts to save herself had scraped her palms raw and made a bloody mess of her hands. It hurt to close her fists. It hurt to hold things. It would be difficult to drag Pendry anywhere in this state. Tearing strips of fabric from her tunic, she wrapped the woolen scraps around her hands in an effort to staunch the bleeding and protect the damaged, sensitive skin. All right, so we're at our first move for the session. Exciting. But first, a couple notes. Really only one note. I'm proud of myself for pronouncing staunch correctly. This easily could have been another chasm situation if you watched session 2, where I basically mispronounced a word the entire session. This one, staunch, is even more provocative. What a strange way to spell that word. It's spelled stanch, but it's pronounced staunch. I mean, I Googled this. All right, so our first move, we're going to do the heal move because Lucia's hands are injured. They're torn up and wounded, and they hurt. So we're going to try to heal that. So our action score is 1 plus 2 wits equals 3. Terrible. Our challenge dice were 6 and 10, so 3 doesn't beat either of those, so that is a miss. And the result of that is we pay the price. So something bad has to happen. I tend to be in the habit of being way too hard on myself mechanically. If I roll a miss, I tend to kind of reach for mechanical consequences, reducing stats, things like that, which can be quite painful for both myself and for the viewer. You don't need to play that way, for sure. And honestly, it just makes it so much more difficult if you're too hard on yourself. So learn from my example, or do as I say, not as I do. If you're playing Ironsworn, go easy on yourself if you feel comfortable with that. Just because you roll a miss does not mean you have to reduce your health or your supply or anything like that. This is a good example of that. In this situation, we're already hurt, we're already injured, so I'm not going to reduce our stats any further just because I rolled a miss. The narrative consequence of this is that, well, the treatment didn't work. Her hands still hurt, so we will see that right now. Despite her makeshift attempt at treatment, her hands still stung, badly. She would do what she could to take Pendry to Timberwall, but she doubted she'd be able to draw her bow, at least not without an immense amount of pain. A journey across the havens in the dark of night was a dangerous proposition. The pair would be vulnerable to wild animals and savage raiders, and the inability to use a weapon would put them at perilous risk. But they hardly had a choice, and so Lucia would do what she must. "Can you get up?" she asked Pendry, who was still lying motionless on the ground. "Can you walk?" With tremendous effort, he tried lifting up his head and chest, stopping with a sudden, sharp exhalation as he felt a stabbing pain near the bottom of his ribs. He lay back down with a whimper. "How about your legs?" Lucia said, her hopes sinking. Pendry attempted to shift each leg, first his left, then his right. There was some slight movement, but it was accompanied by Pendry's wretched, pained groans. "It hurts to move," he confessed weakly. "Then don't," Lucia replied absently, her mind already moving on to consider other possibilities. She needed a way to transport Pendry. She wouldn't be able to carry him out of the forest on her own, let alone bear him 4 leagues across the havens to Timberwall. Taking stock of her surroundings, she tried to gather materials that might ease her burden. All right, another move. She's trying to gather materials to ease her burden. You might almost say she's trying to secure an advantage. She's making preparations with expertise. So we're going to use our wits for this. And our action score is 5 plus 2 wits equals 7, which is pretty good. And that is a strong hit because our challenge dice are 1 and 4. So the result of that is we get plus 2 momentum. Nice. When I first started playing Ironsworn, I didn't really think too much about momentum, like, that's kind of boring. But as you saw, or as you hopefully saw in our last session, we used the burn momentum mechanic to turn a miss into a weak hit, which was super useful. So actually now I'm very excited when we gain momentum, because momentum can be a very useful resource. All right, so we succeeded with this move, so we're going to gain an advantage. Lucia snapped 2 sturdy branches off a nearby tree and laid them across each other on the ground in the shape of an unbalanced X, the deeper portion of it long enough for Pendry to fit in while lying down. Using a small hunting knife she had brought with her, Lucia trimmed the branches until they were fairly smooth all the way across. She had packed light for her trip into the forest that day, but her father had always stressed to her the importance of preparing for the worst. She had a small length of rope she carried with her for emergencies, and she used a segment of it now to lash the 2 poles together and hold their shape. She completed the wooden frame by tying 4 shorter branches across the deep portion of the X, creating a platform that a person could lie on top of. By the time she was done, she had built a simple triangular sled. Her father had taught her the skill years ago during one of their hunting trips into the forest when she was a girl. The contraption was crude, but with luck, it would hold. Now to find a way out of the ravine. All right, so that was several paragraphs of Lucia building a sled. It's funny, in the previous session, Lucia, she shot the bear with her bow and arrow like 3 different times, and each of those times, I described it with like 1 sentence each. And then here, we have a whole treatise on how she built this sled. This sled is actually pretty important. The sled is one of the MVPs in this session. We have another MVP who's coming later, so stick around for that. But yeah, this sled is super important, and it's actually based on a real thing. I did some research, and apparently there's this thing called a travois, I think is how it's pronounced. I believe it was invented by the First Nations people of Canada to transport goods across long distances. You can kind of picture it like a wheelbarrow, but in reverse, so you're dragging it behind you. It's triangular. This was a lifesaver, because if my research hadn't shown me that this is a thing that exists, I don't know how Lucia would have gotten Pendry out of here. This forest is 4 leagues or 12 miles away from Timberwall, so she would have had to somehow transport him 12 miles by herself, which isn't really realistic. Like, she's not really going to carry him all that way, especially if he's injured. So luckily, the travois exists, and so that's what she's using. All right, so now time for another secure and advantage move. We're trying to find our way out of the ravine, so we are assessing a situation with observation. So that's wits again. And man, I feel like we've been using wits for so many moves. I kind of wish I had made her a genius or something. All right, so our action score is 1 plus 2 wits equals 3, which is pretty bad. But luckily, our challenge dice are even lower, or one of them is. We got a 1 and a 3 for challenge dice, and that is a weak hit. And the result of that is we get 1 momentum. So we're at 6 momentum so far. In the distance, Lucia saw a pile of boulders heaped against one side of the ravine, reaching all the way to the top. The slope looked significant, but climbable. How she would climb it while dragging Pendry behind her on a sled, she didn't know. But she would face that problem when she had to. Placing the sled next to Pendry, Lucia carefully shifted him onto the crude wooden vehicle. Standing in the shallow portion of the X, Lucia bent her knees and reached down to grab the sled's handles. Then she stood up. Immediately, an intense, stinging sensation shot through her injured palms as she gripped tightly to support the sled's weight. Steeling herself against the pain, Lucia began to walk, dragging Pendry along behind her. There was nowhere to go but forward. There was nothing to do but go on. All right, and here our journey begins. We are undertaking a journey because we are traveling across hazardous or unfamiliar lands. All right, so our action score is 3 plus 2 wits equals 5, and our challenge dice are super high, so 9 and 10. That's a miss, so not a great start to our journey. The result is that we pay the price, so some mechanical or narrative consequence. So here's our journey track. Journeys are similar to combat and vows in that they have a progress track that you fill in as you go. In this case, because we rolled a miss, we don't fill in anything on our journey track. And actually, the journey mechanic was pretty confusing for me for a while. Like, I think I had a misunderstanding of how it worked because my thought was, oh, okay, well, if you roll a miss, that means that you don't make progress because you don't fill in your progress track, which implies that if you roll a bunch of misses, like if you just roll miss after miss, that means that you're never going to get to your destination, right? And that's not good. Or if you roll a bunch of misses, you're going to have to deal with so many consequences that you could die before you reach your destination because your stats get so low. But luckily, I found this Reddit thread recently, which I forget the name of it, but I'll link it in the description of this video. One of the commenters on that thread explained journeys in a way that really made sense for me. And I don't know if that person is correct. I mean, they're not the game designer, but their explanation made a lot of sense. And I think that's how I'm going to do my journeys in this campaign. Basically, how they explained it is your journey takes some sort of set amount of time, let's say 5 moves. You'll make your rolls, and if you get a hit, you'll mark progress. If you get a miss, you won't. But regardless of how many hits or misses you get, your journey will end. For example, if I say, oh, my journey is going to be like 5 moves long, if I get a miss on all of those, that means that my progress track will be empty by the time my journey is done. But the journey will still be complete. It's just that my progress track is empty. I really like that approach because it basically means that you're not going to get stuck into this like death spiral of unlucky rolls where you keep missing and so you never get to your destination. So your journey doesn't get stretched out to a really uncomfortable degree. So yes, I like that approach, and I think that's probably how you're supposed to play this. I think it's just a little bit confusing when you're newer to the game. So that's how we're going to do it. And so for this first leg of our journey, I rolled a miss, and so our progress track is empty so far. And as I hinted earlier, this journey from Bleakwood Forest to Timberwall is super closely tied to our vow, because our vow right now is to bring Pendry home to Timberwall. That vow and this journey are very closely tied together, and as a result, throughout this session, they're pretty much going to advance at the same time, or nearly the same time. There will be some subtleties where maybe one or the other resolves first, just so that it's not super redundant. But yeah, in essence, the journey is required for the vow, and so they're very closely tied together. As she neared the boulders, Lucia's heart sank as she realized that the pile of stones was steeper than she initially thought. A chaotic accumulation of rocks, logs, and other forest debris that had fallen into the ravine over the slow course of centuries, the slope looked difficult and exhausting to climb. The one saving grace was that most of the boulders appeared to be no higher than Lucia's waist, and so, while daunting, the climb was not impossible. "Are you ready?" she asked Pendry, who groaned weakly in response. All right, so we are climbing up this pile of boulders to try to get out of the ravine. So we are facing danger, and we are attempting something risky with strength. Our action score is 2 + 2 iron equals 4, and luckily we got a weak hit. 1 and 8 are the challenge dice, and the result of that is we lose 1 supply. Oh, so now our supply is starting to go down. Uh-oh. As she clambered on top of the first boulder and turned back to pull Pendry's sled up behind her, Lucia's grip gave out. Her hands were in too much pain. The thin strips of shirt fabric she had wrapped around them did little to shield her wounded palms from the hard surface of the sled's rough-hewn wooden handles. After a moment's hesitation, it had been a cold day, and the evening had brought with it even cooler temperatures, Lucia took off her coat and, stretching it out in front of her, wound a woolen sleeve around each sled handle. The makeshift padding formed a pair of thick, cushioned grips that were much more comfortable for her to hold. With a slight shiver, Lucia reached once again for the sled. It was no matter. In time, the heat of physical exertion would counteract the effects of the evening cold. At least, she hoped it would. Over the course of an exhausting hour, the pair ascended the rocky slope, Lucia leading the way and dragging Pendry up behind her, while Pendry tried his best to assist by pulling and pushing against any solid surface he could reach, while maintaining a desperate one-handed grip on the sled to keep himself from sliding off. When they reached the top of the ravine, the two were drained, but they were free. All right, we've made progress on our vow. When you do a vow, the vow has a progress track, and it's really up to you to decide what your milestones are going to be. Anytime you kind of make a decent amount of progress on your vow, you can consider that a milestone, and you can fill in progress on your progress track. I'm going to say that reaching the top of the ravine is a milestone for us, and so we're going to fill in progress on our vow. Our vow's rank is dangerous, and so we fill in 2 progress boxes for each milestone. Each box contains 4 ticks. So for 2 boxes, that's 2 times 4 equals 8, and so that's why we're getting 8 ticks here. In total, there's 10 boxes, so 10 times 4 is 40. In order to fill up this progress track, we would need 40 ticks. All right, so we are on our way. After a brief rest, Lucia peered at the surrounding forest to see if she could intuit the correct way to go. All right, so another secure and advantage move. We are assessing a situation with observation. So that's 1 plus 2 wits equals 3. And unfortunately, that is a miss because our challenge dice were 3 and 8. So we pay the price. And here's another good example of having just a narrative consequence versus a mechanical consequence. We could go hardcore and reduce one of our stats for some reason, but that would be very unforgiving to us as the player. So in this case, we're just going to do a narrative consequence. And I feel like secure and advantage is one of the easier moves to do this with, because with other moves, like combat moves, for example, if you fail, it kind of makes more sense that you would lose a stat, like you'd get injured or hurt. But for secure and advantage, it's very easy to imagine that, oh, okay, you tried something and it didn't work, and that's it. So that's paying the price. That's the result of your miss. So it's not any sort of terrible mechanical consequence. It's purely narrative. No luck. The endless lines of trees looked the same in every direction. All she could do was pick a path and hope for the best. Hope that if the route was wrong, she'd somehow notice before it was too late. Hope that the elder beast that had chased them into this mess had roamed far, far away by now and wasn't tracking their scent, plotting gruesome revenge. Hope that... Where do we go now? Pendry's voice interrupted her thoughts. Pick a direction, she said offhandedly. We're lost? Utterly. Lucia sighed as she moved back in position to pick up the sled handles. We're going to start walking, she said. The trees are older and the canopy denser the deeper you go into the forest. If we start seeing larger trees and less sky, that'll tell us we're going the wrong way. Are you sure that'll work? Pendry asked. A silence that felt longer than it was. Then, with more confidence than she felt, Lucia replied, Yes. All right. Oh, and a quick shout out, quick thank you to one of my YouTube commenters on the previous video. Mark Little suggested that, maybe the bear is tracking their scent. And so that gave me the idea for including this little detail, which I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. So yeah, thank you, Mark, for suggesting that detail. I really appreciate it when you guys leave comments. If you really enjoy the story and you feel super compelled to suggest something, feel free. I read every comment, and if an idea works with the story, I'll try to incorporate it. No promises, of course, especially if a lot of people do this. I probably won't be able to incorporate every single thing people suggest into the story, especially because I have my own ideas that I want to make sure to include. But yeah, always feel free. If you have ideas, leave a comment. Even if they don't make it into the canon story, I'm sure that they're interesting for other people to read. All right, so we're at our next leg in the journey, so we're going to do the undertake a journey move again. And this time our action score is 2 plus 2 wits equals 4, and luckily we got a weak hit versus a 3 and a 5. Our first hit of this journey. So we reach a waypoint, so we make good progress on our journey. We get +2 progress on our journey track, but we also lose 1 supply because it was only a weak hit, not a strong hit. After only a few minutes of walking, Lucia paused and placed the sled back down. Evening had turned into night, and now it was difficult to see through the darkness. Lucia took a small torch from off her belt and handed it to Pendry, who held it up as she used flint and steel to set the stick alight. How long will the sled last? Pendry asked as he gazed dubiously at the torch's weak, guttering flame. Long enough, Lucia said as she picked up the sled handles. And so the two wandered on. All right, and then here is our journey track, which has gotten 2 progress boxes, so that's 2 times 4 is 8 ticks. The journey's rank is dangerous, and so that's why we're filling up 2 progress boxes for every milestone. Lucia felt fortune smile on her at last, like life-giving rain falling after an interminable drought, felt her heart lift as she saw the trees gradually start to thin as she trudged tiredly along. By some trick of merciful fate, she had chosen the right direction to go, and without much incident, she and Pendry eventually found themselves, haggard but whole, at the ragged border of Bleakwood Forest. All right, we made it. Well, we made it partway. So we have escaped Bleakwood Forest, and I'm going to say that that's a milestone for our vow. So once again, we get 2 progress boxes, so that's 8 ticks, and we are up to here. So yeah, we're making good progress. Pendry, she breathed, we made it. Thank the gods, and just in time too. He sighed as their valiant little torch finally flickered out. Unobscured by the forest canopy, the moon's light was just enough to illuminate the vast grassy landscape of the haven spreading out endlessly before them. Now what? Pendry asked. It's 4 leagues to Timberwall, Lucia said as she stared out across the scrubland. With luck, we won't encounter any raiders. Kasara will be calm enough to cross, and we'll arrive at Timberwall by daybreak. That doesn't seem too bad. With luck, it won't be, Lucia agreed. She reached down to lift up the sled. But we have a stop we need to make first. All right, so our third leg of the journey, and our action score is 2 plus 2 wits equals 4, and our challenge dice are pretty low. Only a 1 and a 3, so that is a strong hit. So we reach a waypoint, get +2 progress, and no consequences, so we don't lose any supply. In the dim light of the moon, after nearly 2 hours of walking, Lucia saw it first. A small wooden dwelling, standing isolated and proud atop a cultivated patch of land that stood in stark contrast to the shrubby wilderness that surrounded it. She was home. All right, so here's our journey tracker, and we got 2 progress, that's 8 more ticks. You live here? Pendry asked as Lucia dragged him toward the wooden building. On the way, they passed barren plots of land that were intended to grow herbs and vegetables, an empty paddock that formerly held horses, but no longer did, and once-strong fences that had fallen into disrepair. As they approached the house, they were greeted by a vigorous, booming bark, shortly followed by a compact black streak rushing at them across the dusty ground. Lucia's face brightened at the sight and sound. "Cormac!" she exclaimed with more enthusiasm than Pendry had heard from her the entire day. The black streak came to a halt and resolved itself into a sleek, muscular hound whose head reached as high as an average man's hips. Powerfully wagging its thick tail, it nuzzled into Lucia's arms as she knelt down to stroke the dog gently behind the ears. "I left Cormac to protect the house while I went into the forest," Lucia explained, "but we'll need him to guard us as we travel across the havens. My hands will be useless for my bow while I'm dragging you along." Pendry scarcely dared to breathe as the large animal curiously sniffed his face. "Well, if he's as friendly as you," he said nervously at last, "then I'm sure we'll get along just fine." Cormac gave him a friendly lick on the cheek. All right, so we got our dog back. As I'd said earlier, Lucia has a hound companion as one of her assets, but the hound was not with her in the forest. He was too busy protecting the house while she was away, but now we have him back, and his name is Cormac, and he wrote a novel called No Country for Old Dogs. That's a deep cut reference for those who know. All right, so that should balance things out a bit. When I was playing this part of the session, I didn't know how the rest of the journey would go. If we would, maybe have a combat encounter. And as I said earlier, when she failed to heal herself, Lucia can't really use her bow because it would hurt too much. It would hurt her hands. And so we definitely needed something to protect us in case we encountered some foes along the way. So Cormac is here to protect us and just be cute. All right, and I'm going to say that getting Cormac back is a milestone in our journey. And so we get 2 more progress boxes, so that's 8 more ticks. So we're over halfway through on our progress track. Minutes later, Lucia emerged from the house after entering to search for anything that might be useful on their journey. "Nothing," she sighed. "It's been a while since I resupplied. I was due for a visit to Timberwall anyway." She looked by turns at the man and the dog. "All right, let's go." All right, so the 4th leg of our journey. We are almost there. I'm going to say that this journey is 5 moves long. We are on our 4th. So our action score is 4 plus 2 wits equals 6, and we get another strong hit. Nice. We've been pretty lucky with these rolls lately. So the result is we reach a waypoint and get +2 progress. They reached Kasara at midnight. Kasara was a river, wide and deep, flowing southward across the havens. The firstborn had named it after the ancient forest it ran alongside, Kinzura. But the newly arrived Ironlanders had altered its name to Kasara when the native syllables fell too awkwardly on their tongues. "We're at the river," Lucia announced, waking Pendry, who had fallen asleep. So this is just a fun little detail I decided to include. I could have just rolled for a random name for this river in the Ironsworn Oracle tables, but I think that if you can add little unique details to your world building, it really helps the world come to life and feel more realistic. So what I did here, the idea is that Kinzura is the native name of the forest and its associated river, but when the Ironlanders came, they didn't know how to pronounce it or they didn't want to pronounce it, and so they altered the name to something slightly similar but different. That's a little world-building detail that I included to try to bring the world a little bit more to life. All right, so we have 8 more ticks on our journey track. Kasara's calm surface belied a strong current. Lucia had heard too many stories growing up of hapless, unprepared folk, young and old, being sucked down and drowned in its inscrutable depths. Peering upriver and downriver, she sought out the most advantageous spot for them to attempt their crossing. All right, so one more time, we're doing secure an advantage. We've done that a lot lately. We're assessing a situation with observation, so our action score is 6 plus 2 wits equals 8, and we got a weak hit. We get 1 momentum. Nice. Our momentum bar is filling up really nicely. Years of experience had ingrained in Lucia an instinct for finding exactly the right path across Kasara. She and her parents had made the crossing countless times throughout her childhood. But fording a river during the day, independently and at full health, was different from crossing it in the dark, while injured and dragging along an even more injured man. Lucia found a strip of river shallow enough for her to walk across, with the water coming up only to her waist. It was a crossing she had used dozens of times before, and luckily, she'd been able to recognize the spot in the dim moonlight. "Are you ready, Cormac?" she asked the dauntless dog, who fearlessly waded forward and began to paddle determinedly toward the opposite shore. Once Cormac was safely on the other side and shaking the water from his coat, Lucia turned and knelt down next to Pendry, reaching an arm out to help him up. "The sled won't float," she told him. "I'll help you get across, then I'll come back for it. I know it hurts, but you have to get up, just for a little while." With Pendry leaning heavily on her and relying on her arm for support, the two began the river crossing. Yeah, this is basically the Cormac show now. I said earlier at the start of the session that we have two MVPs. One is the sled, the wooden sled, and the other is, it's probably Cormac. All right, so we are crossing the river, and so we are facing danger, attempting something risky with strength. So our action score is 2 + 2 iron equals 4, and we get a weak hit. The consequence is we lose 1 supply. They made it halfway without incident, encountering no trouble other than Lucia's tiredness and Pendry's pained groans as he put weight on his injured legs. A little over halfway across, something went wrong. As Lucia stepped forward, the pitiless unpredictability of nature offered her not the solid ground she was expecting, but a loose stone that shifted as she transferred her weight. She stumbled, and Pendry went down with her. Rather than fall forward, they slipped to the side and were soon swept by the current into a deeper portion of the river where their feet couldn't touch the bottom. In a panic, Pendry flailed, wrapping his arms tightly around Lucia as she struggled to keep her head above water. Kicking her feet and sculling her arms, she fought desperately against the river's downward pull as she and Pendry started to sink. Distantly, she heard a splash as Cormac jumped into the water, felt a tug across her torso as the dog took the strap of her arrow quiver in its teeth and tried to tow the two toward shore. Spurred by the hound's selflessness, Lucia kicked and swam even harder. Through their combined efforts, Lucia and Cormac maneuvered closer and closer to the river's edge. As Cormac tugged, the arrow quiver suddenly came loose, slipping over Lucia's head. In the chaos, the dog opened its mouth and lost hold of the quiver strap, but by then, the group had made it close enough to shore. With tremendous relief, Lucia felt her foot touch solid ground. As she pulled herself up onto the riverbank and turned to help Pendry, Lucia felt a pang of regret as she saw her quiver full of arrows float away down the river. But it was no matter. She was alive. All right, so we're down to 2 supply, but we are almost done with our journey. We're almost there. We've crossed the river. I'm going to say that that's a milestone on our vow to bring Pendry home to Timberwall, and so we get 8 more ticks. So we are very close. Just 1 more milestone, and we will be done with this vow. After a short rest and a trip back across the river to retrieve Pendry's sled, Lucia prepared the group to set off on the last leg of their journey. "That was the hard part," she said as she gently lifted Pendry back onto the wooden sled. "It's 2 leagues from here to Timberwall, but the miles will pass quickly. You'll be home before sunrise." "It's cold," Pendry whispered. His clothes were soaked through, and he was shivering. Lucia knit her brow, but otherwise tried to conceal her worry. They didn't have any dry clothing or blankets, and they didn't have anything they could use to make a fire. Carefully, she lifted Pendry's shoulders and eased his damp coat and tunic off of him. She took off his wet boots and socks. They just had to hope that the night wouldn't get any colder, and that their clothes and bodies would get dry as they traveled on. All right, this is the final leg of our journey. It's been going pretty well so far. It started off with a miss, but otherwise we've been doing pretty well. And this time our action score is 6 + 2 = 8, and we get another strong hit. So ending our journey strong, and the consequence for this is we reach a waypoint. We get +2 progress, +1 momentum, and -1 supply. Why the heck is that? Where did that come from? Oh, okay, I remember now. Oh my gosh, I should have written this down maybe. So when you undertake a journey, if you get a strong hit, you actually have 2 options for your consequences. The first option is to just progress normally, so you get +2 progress. And that's what we've been doing so far. That's why our previous strong hits for undertake a journey, we just get the waypoint and +2 progress. In this case, though, we use the other option. The other option is to move at speed. And what that does is it gives us +1 momentum at the cost of -1 supply. I chose to do that for this leg of the journey because I thought narratively it made sense. We just said that Pendry is shivering, he's at risk of hypothermia. That's not good. So in my view, that would have caused Lucia to move faster and to, not take her sweet time with getting to Timberwall. And so that is why I decided to do that option for undertake a journey. Our result from this is we reach a waypoint, we get +2 progress, and +1 momentum because we're moving quickly, but at the cost of -1 supply. After several more hours of walking, Lucia saw the distant silhouette of timber wall framed against the early light of dawn. And not a moment too soon. The wooden sled Lucia was dragging behind her was all the worse for wear, beaten and battered by the long journey, and on the verge of falling apart. Pendry lay fast asleep on top of it. So for the -1 supply, I decided that our wooden sled got kind of beat up. And the implication is that if we lost one more supply, maybe the sled would break or something like that. All right, and with that, we get +2 progress on our journey. I said earlier that this journey would only be 5 moves long. We got a miss on our first move, so that's why our progress track is not completely full. But basically, for our journey, our progress score is 8. And because we're at the end, we've reached our destination, we're going to make the reach your destination move because our journey is at an end. This is a progress move, so we don't use an action score or action dice like normal. All we do for this is we count up our progress, like how many boxes we fully filled, and then we compare that to our challenge dice. So our challenge dice for this were 7 and 9. Our progress was 8, so that is a weak hit. We beat the 7 but not the 9. Pretty good result. And the consequence of this is that we arrive but face an unforeseen hazard or complication. And we shall see what that complication is right now. With a relieved grin, Lucia breathed, "Pendry, we made it. We're here." She heard no response. "Pendry?" She turned to look at him. Pendry didn't wake, nor even stir. Setting the sled down, Lucia rushed over and knelt down next to him. She put her fingers under his nose to check for his breathing, then put her head on his chest to listen for his heartbeat. With her own heart feeling suddenly tighter in her chest, Lucia decided that the man must certainly be alive. Surely they couldn't have come all this way only for him to succumb at the last moment. Hurrying back to pick up the sled handles, Lucia forged on with renewed energy and urgency. Alright, so our unforeseen complication for our journey is that Pendry has taken a turn for the worse, so we don't know if he's going to survive. As the travelers approached Timberwall, the settlement's strong wooden ramparts loomed imposingly over them. Looking up, Lucia saw the usual guards patrolling the parapets. As she walked closer, one of the guards seemed to notice the newcomers. She saw the dark silhouette of his arm lift up and point toward her and Pendry. She saw him call out to the other guards and watched the walls suddenly come to life as men ran behind the battlements and conferred urgently among themselves, apparently attempting to organize a response to the new arrivals. That was strange. Lucia had been to Timberwall countless times, and the wall guards were generally a lazy lot who were content to let visitors simply present themselves at the town gate. Alright, so we have made it to the walls of Timberwall. I'm going to say that that's the final milestone we need for our vow. That gives us the last 8 ticks on our progress track, and so our progress track is full. Now we can make the fulfill your vow move, because we've achieved what we believe to be the fulfillment of our vow. Similar to the reach your destination move for the journey, this is a progress move, so no action score, no action die. We just compare our progress score to our challenge dice, and in this case, our progress score is 10, and our challenge dice are 1 and 8, so this is a strong hit. And the result of that is our quest is complete, and we get +2 experience points. And because we completed this vow, we helped Pendry. I'm actually going to say that we have reached a milestone for our other vow, our background vow, which is to found the first city of the Ironlands, because Pendry, as we will find out shortly, is a pretty important person, and so helping him will help us on our long-term background vow, because he's going to be a fairly important political player, I assume. We'll see how that pans out. Alright, so our background vow is to found the first city of the Ironlands, and it is an epic vow, which means that for each milestone, we get 1 tick, which is very slow. A progress track has 10 boxes, each one has 4 ticks, so 10 times 4 is 40. So in order to fill this bar all the way to the top, we would need 40 ticks, that's 40 milestones, and that's a lot. So I think what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to try to make progress on this vow as often as possible. I won't ruin the story just for the sake of getting progress. I don't want to ruin the pacing of our narrative, but I will try to find every opportunity I can to make progress on this vow, because I don't want this campaign to take forever. The great wooden gate of the settlement opened to release a troop of town guards. To Lucia's surprise, they ignored her entirely, rushing instead to the side of the injured man lying atop the sled. She heard them whispering concernedly over him. Unsure of what to do, Lucia looked at Cormac, who stared back at her, cocking his head quizzically. As some of the men moved to put Pendry on a stretcher they had brought with them, Lucia grabbed the arm of a nearby guard. Hold on, where are you taking him? She asked. The man looked down at her, but didn't deign to reply. Many of the wall guards were long-serving veterans who had encountered Lucia many times over the years, and they, like most of Timberwall, were resentful of her family's disreputable ancestry. He was injured in a fall, Lucia pressed on, undeterred. We forded the Kasara River and his clothes got soaked through. He needs medical treatment right away. And he'll get it, the soldier gruffly replied. He's the governor's son, so we'll have the best doctors in Timberwall tending to him. He glared disapprovingly at Lucia, and then at Cormac. You're no longer needed here. You can go. As Lucia stood in stunned silence, processing this new information, the guards finished loading Pendry onto the stretcher and began carrying him back to the gate. Lucia stood there a short while, debating within herself whether to put up any resistance. Ultimately, she decided that the town guards had no reason to lie, and if it so happened that Pendry was the spoiled scion of an important family, then that was all the better for him. As the last of the guards walked away, Lucia came back to herself, felt fully for the first time the bone-deep weariness she had tried to ignore for the past several hours. Beckoning silently to Cormac, she left the battered wooden sled where it was and fell into step behind the retreating guards, slipping smoothly in through the town gate before it shut firmly behind them. And so she found herself, once again, in the Lion's Mouth, in the one place in the Ironlands she least liked to be. She was in Timberwall. Dun dun dun. All right, another long session today. Thanks for sticking with it. Coming up next, in Session 4, we will enter the town of Timberwall, learn more about Pendry's identity, and see what complications fate has in store for Lucia. All right, so yeah, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next episode. Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel if you do that. Leave a comment if you have any thoughts or feedback on the story so far. Thanks again. See you next time.